for those that are tuning in, and I imagine that word is now starting to circulate. I imagine most people aware now, but Antonio Inoki, who we had known had been in poor health for some time, passing away, and the news kind of came out just a few hours ago, which would be Saturday in Japan, but Friday night in North America. This is one of those figures, way where you don't even know where to begin when it comes to the historical legacy and the amount of influence that Antonio Inoki carried. I mean, outside of Ricky Dozan, you would. I think very clearly look at him as the second biggest figure that went far beyond just professional wrestling within the country in Japan. This is a major figure, obviously.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, one of the, foundational building blocks of the industry in Japan. And I think by extension, like looking at the Japanese influence in professional wrestling today in both, in all facets, really, I think you can't really overstate his impact enough, both in wrestling and MMA.
Yeah, I will always go back to that moment when we were there for New Year's Dash back in 2020, and Antonio Inoki appearing on the screen, and this like gasp from the crowd, because Antonio Inoki, for as much as he is credited as the founder of New Japan Pro Wrestling, also like a lot of resentment towards Antonio Inoki of where the company was when he finally sold it in 2005, and sort of was, I wouldn't say erased from their history, but very much removed from it. And that was it was telling in several ways, the fact that Antonio Inoki was utilized for the Liger retirement show, but being there in person. I think it also was an acknowledgement of where his health was. And I don't know if you saw that clip over the summer where he appeared on a program in Japan, and you could just see, how frail he had become, that it was, for anyone that had, associated Antonio Inoki, and to see him in that state, like you knew, how much this illness had been, ravaging him.
Didn't he state that one of his goals was to appear at the anniversary show? And ultimately that never happened.
Yes, and you had Okada mention that numerous times throughout this 50th anniversary year of, and I think that's pretty telling that Antonio Inoki could not show up for all of that. And then, out of the blue, we saw him just do that appearance over the summer on that program, and you could see the state that he was in. So we do have, a story that is pretty much just like a cursory overview of some of the highlights of his career. Obviously, we could go a lot more extensive, but he was an individual who grew up. He was one of 11 children, and his father died at a very young age. I believe that Kanji Inoki, Antonio Inoki, was 5 years old when his father died, and then spent a lot of his formative years growing up in Brazil, and then it was later being recruited back to Japan. He excelled in track and athletics in Brazil, and then fell under the wing of Ricky Dozan and came into the JWA, as it was known, and it was essentially himself, Kentaro Oki, and Giant Baba that were seen as the three next ones to succeed Ricky Dozan. And they were kind of forced into that spot much earlier, because it was Antonio Inoki debuted at the end of, actually, September 30th, 1960, which is today's date, was his debut in 1960. That's quite the coincidence. So he debuted in 1960, and 63 is when Ricky Dozan dies. And, that had a massive impact on JWA's business at the time, and, the circumstances around Ricky Dozan's death. And then Inoki actually left JWA for about a year to go with Tokyo Pro Wrestling, which only lasted about a year, comes back to JWA, and business actually gets very strong during those ensuing years. And one of Inoki's teams was teaming with Baba, and they were like the big team there in JWA. And then those two would eventually branch out. They would leave on their own. And in 1972, he forms New Japan Pro Wrestling, while Baba launches All Japan Pro Wrestling. But it was, sort of like they began as like the links, like each other's sort of, competing to be who would be the successor. And it was kind of natural in some ways that they would eventually break off and go in those directions. And, here we are 50 years years later, both companies who have gone through many, many, many different iterations throughout those 50 years, but here they are under those banners. But it was Inoki that I think that really showed you like his marketing sense. Like Baba had the pipeline to the NWA, and eventually New Japan would join the NWA, but it was Inoki presenting his idea of, if pro wrestling was real, who would be the toughest? And he became the hallmark for that question, and bringing in people with, legitimate credentials, Willem Ruska, and later you would see all the different names that he would bring in and beat these guys and present to his public that if all of this were real, this is our guy. This is Antonio Inoki, who is the toughest of the tough. And no more famous fight than the 1976 one with Muhammad Ali that aired on closed circuit throughout the U.S. with many different wrestling promoters kind of piggybacking off of that. Most not doing that well. This was, have you ever like sat down and watched any of that fight, Way?
I think just clips. Honestly, I don't think I sat down to watch the actual match. No.
It's hard to track down the entire thing. I know at different points I've seen like the entire thing up there. I've never sat through the entire thing of it, but seen enough and read the books on it. But it's a horrendous fight where, I mean, the idea was, Ali coming in. This is, at his drawing peak, and he was in between big fights. He was about to fight Ken Norton in September. He had just fought the previous month, and they. I definitely recommend Josh Gross's book, an entire book dedicated to this fight, and it's fascinating. And you can just see the images here in the background. There's the referee, Judo Gene LaBelle, who just died recently this year, and Ali passing away back in 2016. So, it ends up, they go into it, and it's a legitimate fight, and Inoki spends most of it on his back delivering leg kicks. And by today's modern scoring, like this would have been a very convincing win for Antonio Inoki. Not an exciting one, but that's where what was known at the time. And you had the two judges. One judge scored it for Inoki, one scored it for Ali. So the deciding scorecard went to Judo Gene LaBelle, who it was a draw, and thus we had a split draw. And the person that has benefited the greatest from all of this is Antonio Inoki. Like, this is credited as like the birth, the quote unquote birth of mixed martial arts in Japan. And for Antonio Inoki, this is the celebrated fight in his history, while for Ali, I mean, the boxing media treated this like a joke, and this is hardly something in Ali's background that is celebrated. Both would go on to note like they were paid significantly less than what was than that was promised to them. I believe Ali was promised $6 million, got far less than that. And Inoki getting far less than that as well. But it's, one of those extremely historically significant fights, and probably the most famous one in Japanese history. But that was a playbook that Inoki found such great success with, and it's a lesson that we have seen countless times of wrestling promoters that strike gold with an idea, but then they just run that idea into the ground. And, you saw like the 80s explosion of New Japan when that was truly their peak with Inoki, with Riki Choshu, with Tiger Mask, and then the innovations with the junior heavyweights throughout that decade as well. They were on network television. I mean, it was just a glorious decade for New Japan, and then into the 90s. But as the 90s kind of came to an end and you entered the 2000s, then you see the rise of Pride in the country. K1 is a huge deal in the country. And it was, Antonio Inoki's dream of seeing all this like legitimate fighting that was seeing such a popularity boom. And he was tied to the early days of Pride. And thus you saw the mixing and matching of fighters coming into New Japan, sending guys like Yuji Nagata into shoots. And it became a period that I think it took a great toll on New Japan's business. That's very factual, and I think stunted the growth of a lot of stars during that generation in professional wrestling, and very few that came out of that unscathed that were directly involved in those shoots, and a period that is largely considered like a very dark period for New Japan's history. And then finally, Inoki sells to Yuke's in 2005. Yuke's would run the company until selling it to Bushiroad several years later. And Antonio Inoki, I mean, he would start the IGF promotion in 2007. He, of course, had an extensive political career that goes back to the late 80s. And someone that, I mean, he is revered in Japan. He will obviously have his detractors, but man, there is just so much that you can go into regarding the history of Antonio Inoki. And I know that we can't do it justice tonight, but Sunday night, WH Park and I are going to do a bonus show dedicated to Antonio Inoki's career, where we'll get to go into a lot more depth into a lot of the different chapters of Antonio Inoki's career when we have the weekend to go into a lot more. So look out for that Sunday night, Monday morning on the free feed at Post Wrestling.
And all the, tweets and tributes, I mean, they're already starting to pour in, and this news isn't even more than, 4 hours old at this point. So I imagine in the weeks to come, you'll be hearing, sort of their thoughts and sentiments from people from both sides of the ocean.
And they managed to get the mention and a graphic into SmackDown tonight, which was, I don't think the news broke until around like 8:15 p.m. or so. So SmackDown's on the air, and they turned that around within an hour and had that in there.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't. It takes a graphic, and they have an incredible team, of course, and then a bit of a script, for Michael Cole to read. Like a proper production, I think you would expect this sort of stuff to happen. But under a former regime, it seemed like this type of news, number one, wasn't always recognized on TV, and if it was,
dude, Lou Thesz was never acknowledged on WWE television. Like there was a time like they did not acknowledge like certain passings for like whatever reason that they had, or if someone, it was a young death, things like that. Like this was one where like this is breaking news, and we are going to be the show of record that acknowledges this.
Yeah. They made mention of him obviously being a Hall of Famer, and they even made mention of his unofficial WWE title reign being.
Yeah, that was during the Backlund reign, right? Where I mean, it's recognized as just an uninterrupted reign from 1978 till 83. But yes, there was a several day period that Antonio Inoki held the title, and then it is held up, but WWE's record book just has the uninterrupted reign of Bob Backlund. But yeah, it was interesting that was noted by Corey Graves.
And Triple H, I believe, tweeted out already right here saying, one of the most important figures in the history of our business and a man who embodied the term fighting spirit. The legacy of WWE Hall of Famer Antonio Inoki will live on forever.
So there you have it, folks. We will have plenty more this weekend on the life and career of Antonio Inoki.